Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janice Monger, President and CEO of the Staten Island Museum. Welcome to the panel discussion, Perspectives on the Suffrage Centennial, and thank you for joining us virtually today. 100 years ago, women won a long-fought battle to become voters, and the Staten Island Museum has focused on highlighting Staten Islanders' roles in this national history. The conversation today examines this history for its achievements and also its pitfalls. This program represents somewhat of a relaunch of the Staten Island Museum's efforts to mark this centennial. We opened the exhibition, Women of the Nation Arise, Staten Islanders in the Fight for Women's Right to Vote, the weekend of March 6th to 8th. And within a week, New York City was forced to shut down due to the coronavirus pandemic. Our museum has since been closed for these past 4 months. However, the team has been hard at work to bring you virtual programming such as this discussion today. We are so pleased to be able to convene this virtual panel with the scholars and experts that contributed to the exhibition so that you can hear their insights directly. Additionally, we have just launched a newly updated website that features at-home virtual content and an elaborate representation of the exhibition online. And because the Staten Island Museum is located on the beautiful grounds of Snug Harbor, we took advantage of this green space to convert highlights of the exhibition into an outdoor experience for visitors to enjoy while strolling the grounds at Snug Harbor, and you can socially distance and safely do that. You also get to view a biplane sculpture created by the Staten Island Makerspace and Women Museum staff to signify a particularly dramatic moment of suffrage history that happened right here on Staten Island. I'd like to especially thank curator and archives manager Gabriella Leone for these marvelous adaptations of the exhibition online and outdoors, and Riley Edergenoso, Rachel Soma, and Donna Pagano on our staff team for their work to realize these projects amidst the most challenging of circumstances. The Staten Island Museum would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for a planning grant to bring these esteemed experts together to advise us and speak to you today. We thank Con Edison for lead support of the exhibition and several individual donors who contributed: Gina Marie Reitano, Lorelei Stevens and Ian M. Cameron, Edwina Martin, Catherine Aquino, Pamela and Alice Adamo, Maureen Smith, and Susan Grable and George Rappaport. We are grateful to the Staten Island Foundation for marketing and outreach support, and we thank Borough President Otto and NYC & Company for supporting the outdoor presentation of the exhibition. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Sarah Litvin, who is the director of the Rear Center for Immigrant Culture and History in Kingston, New York, and who previously contributed to the New York Historical Society's exhibition Hotbed to commemorate New York State's suffrage centennial in 2017. We've been so fortunate to work with Sarah and Catherine Gray, Susan Goodier, Debbie Ann Paige, Margaret Middleton, all the scholars, and really learn from them. And they've dedicated so much to this project over the past year. So we really, truly appreciate them. And we're really fortunate that we were able to work with them and that you get to hear from them today. So we thank them deeply for their perspectives and their dedication. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sarah Litvin. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice, and thank you everyone so much for joining us today to have this conversation. I'll introduce our panelists in a minute, and I'll share a few thoughts about sort of why this is so pertinent to be having this conversation today, but I just want to do a few housekeeping notes first. I don't get to tell you where the bathroom is, because you know where your bathroom is. But I did want to give you a little sense of how this whole thing is going to go. We're going to start in the first hour by really looking at the exhibition, looking at this history closely, and how you tell that as a part of an exhibition. I think that's one of the things that's so exciting for folks who are trained in the academy and folks who are trained outside of the academy to come together through museums like the Staten Island Museum and projects like this one to learn how we tell stories in ways that make it all make sense and come together. So I'm excited to have all of us get to share some of the history with you as well as some of the storytelling with you. Then in the second hour, we're really going to be looking more at what all this means for today. what the broader story of the suffrage movement teaches us about the social movements of our own day and what strategies we might employ to increase access to voting rights and political power for more Americans now, right? That's really where we're headed and the kind of so what of our whole conversation. And so we'll be sort of sharing different perspectives based on where we're coming from. And we'll invite you as well to think of your own. And we really hope as we go through this today, that you can be thinking about that question. And if you have new ideas about what we all might do to be increasing access to voting rights, what you specifically think of based on the stories of folks you learned from the past, please share them. You know, and we don't get to see your faces. We don't get to understand sort of what's ticking with you and what doesn't. So use the Q&A function, please. Ask your questions, share your memories. We started it for those who were here early, sharing your memory of your first voting experience. This is what this is all about. It's about sharing who we are and our own expertise, wherever that comes from, to be able to move forward together. So I just wanted to give a few thoughts also before introducing our panelists and turning this over to them in a way. You know, we opened this exhibition in March, right? And this panel conversation was supposed to be then. But in a very strange way, today is maybe even more fitting for it. Just earlier this week, we heard from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking about her experience of the challenges that women continue to face when they exert political power today, right? In her words, it was, quote, a pattern of an attitude toward women and dehumanization of others. And then today is also the funeral of Representative John Lewis, right? On his website, he explains the challenge that he sees to voting rights today and the expansion, right? He's been fighting for this his whole life. He says it's not just one law, but many types of laws that are disenfranchising millions of voters. Voter photo identification laws, proof of citizenship laws, barriers to registration, elimination of early voting and absentee voting, and laws making it harder to restore voting rights for people who have paid their debt to society. So with both of these representatives' opinions, experiences in mind, let's go to the past and then come back to the present as we talk about this very timely subject. And who is it who you'll be hearing from today? You'll be hearing from Dr. Susan Goodier. Maybe you can wave when I say your name. Who is an assistant professor of history at SUNY Oneonta, and who you may recognize from the recent PBS special, The Vote, that came out earlier this month. Susan specializes in US public policy history, international gender and culture, and Black women's history. She's the co-author with Karen Pastorello of Women Will Vote, Winning Suffrage in New York State, which provides an intersectional history of the women's suffrage movement. We will hear from Catherine Gray. Wave, Kathy. Who has been a member of the League of Women Voters for over a decade after retiring from her job as a librarian with the Brooklyn Public Library for over 30 years. She was elected co-president of the League of Women Voters for the City of New York in 2016 and only finished her term earlier this spring. And we'll hear from Debbie Ann Paige. There she is, a public historian specializing in local African-American history, co-president of the newly chartered Richard B. Dickinson chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and a professional genealogist. You've already heard the name of Gabby Leone, who's our fearless leader and really the one who spearheaded and lead researcher for this project. She is the archives manager at the Staten Island Museum and the head researcher and curator of Women of the Nation Arise. And last, we have Margaret Middleton. And Margaret is a designer and developer of exhibitions, and they're passionate about the intersection of museum work and social justice movements. So we'll really get, again, thinking more about the storytelling, how all these pieces come together in the exhibition we presented. We're so happy to have everyone here. So enough from me. I want to hear from our panelists with our first kind of round robin question, which is, why did you want to get involved in this in the first place? Why does this history of women's suffrage on Staten Island matter to you? So Gabby, do you want to start with this one?
Well, so I think the idea of this movement happening on Staten Island really spoke to me because often you've thought of, or we've thought of the women's suffrage movement as the story of a few women, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, you know, through their superpowers, fought in Congress for women to get the right to vote. And that's sort of like the idea that I was taught in school. You know, just a few names of suffragists maybe that you learned in social studies or in middle school or in high school. So the idea that women on Staten Island or people on Staten Island were engaged in this fight really spoke to me in a way that made it really relatable, that women were active in their community for women's voting rights. They were making this argument to their neighbors and their friends. And I came across that first in a women's column for the Staten Island World, which was a local newspaper at the time, talking about women at the local fair, the county fair, doing activism, handing out leaflets for women's suffrage. And I thought, we still have a county fair today. What kinds of activism still happen there, or what venues are there for activism now that would be a similar idea? And I thought that would be an interesting way for other people to make a connection to this movement and this fight that maybe seems abstract now that women have had the vote for 100 years.
Susan, how about you?
Well, I started getting interested in this topic when I was an undergraduate, in those days when I didn't know what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be. And I was working in a state historic site near my undergrad college, and was actually accessioning textiles. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I wanted to try a whole lot of things. And as I was going through this old home that had been built in the, I think, 1820, I was gathering up different textiles, napkins and tablecloths and clothing and all these things out of all these different spaces in the back rooms of this house. And I came across a pile of magazines that might have been there who knows how long. But it was the Woman Patriot against feminism, suffrage, and Mormonism. And I said, what's that all about? I had no idea. And so when I went to graduate school, I began to answer that question. I hadn't really thought about, I guess I'd always thought that women were proactive and women were very interested in expanding their rights. And I found out that there was a whole group of women that, and all over the United States, that were opposed to getting rights for themselves. And that's where I started. I actually lifted up a stone and looked at the underside of the issue and issues in order to find out what women were up against in their efforts to get rights. And so that was my first foray into the project. And as I did that, I thought, gee, it would be, we really need to find out what's going on at the same time from the pro women's rights and pro-suffrage movement. And that got me into the work that I did with Karen Pastorello. But it really started from the reverse. How is this so unusual? How is this so unique? Why does there even have to be a movement for women to get a right to vote? So, and that's been the absolute passion of my life, is working in that general area of query.
Wonderful. Debbie Ann, how about you? What got you involved and interested?
I think for me, I always questioned having the ability to see myself reflected in things, right? So as I read history, as I go to the museum, as I look at statues in the park, anywhere I go, I always look for myself in a lot of these items or these places or these time frames. And more often than not, I don't see myself reflected. And then I have to say, well, wait a minute, why is that? I'm here. I wake up Black every morning. And when I show up, you know, my people show up with me. And so for me, doing the history, understanding the people, and I love Staten Island's history. It is an incredible thing. Gabby knows I have this saying that Staten Island is the Forrest Gump of history. If you can name a time and a place and a thing, there's a way to put Staten Island in that space. And I thought, well, if there's a suffrage movement and I never see myself reflected in the images of that, or I don't hear about myself talking about that, then how do I go about doing that? You know, so I started doing some research several years ago, and I uncovered the same anti-suffrage movement here on Staten Island, up here where I live in Grimes Hill. And I said, well, wait a minute now. Okay, if the anti-suffrage movements are happening, then certainly women of color are looking for franchise as well. And so that really is what pushed me to really dig deeper, to be able to uncover those women and give them back to history, or give them back to the world, so that we can know that suffrage didn't happen in a white-centered vacuum.
Cathy, how about you? You're muted, Cathy.
My mother was a League of Women Voters, and I always admired her for the work she did. She worked on the Cultural Revolution in China. So I grew up before there was women's studies. I did not really know much about any women's movement. And so when I became involved in the League myself, I started as an archivist. That was my portfolio. And so that started me learning lots of things about the abolitionist movement, the beginning of the fight in 1848 for women's suffrage, and today's. So I learned a lot about League history and how it felt they built. So one of our past presidents, Percy Maxim Lee, in the 1950s, stated that I was actually aware of how little members knew of their past, and they were too busy building the future to examine the lessons of earlier times. And that statement bothered me because it's true today. I find, well, fortunately, in the last 5 years, we've had a lot of information being put out publicly, like the wonderful film Vote. But as a history major, I learned those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that's George Santayana. And for me, this project gave me an opportunity to examine the history of suffrage in more detail, because I was looking at it from Staten Island. And it was an awesome chance to work with these ladies.
How about you, Margaret? What attracted you to this project?
Well, I've always been interested in women's suffrage, just because I grew up in central New York, just a stone's throw away from Seneca Falls, and I grew up going back to the museum there and learning about that fight, which got me. I want to credit the experience of going to that museum with my interest in feminism and gender justice that I've held with me throughout my career. So I was excited about the opportunity to maybe create some experiences that could potentially inspire somebody like me to take up some of those interests too.
Wonderful. And so you can see, you know, just from these answers to this first question, what a wide range of experiences and backgrounds our panelists brought to, or our advisory committee brought to this project. And I guess I would just share, for me, it had to do with the kind of length and struggle of the suffrage story. And as Janice had mentioned, I got to work on a project that was about New York State suffrage for the New York Historical Society the year before we started this one. And I just said, these women were amazing, right? The sheer determination, and I thought this was a great opportunity to get to learn about one particular group of them. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about this exhibition, right? Historians like to think about things chronologically, and chronology is very important. Things do change over time. But one of the things that's so amazing about this exhibition and the way that we've organized it is that it's all iterative as well, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same, kind of, but also just the same types of behaviors and the same types of activist strategies or tactics are needed to keep things moving forward, especially when there's such a long time frame. So I wanted to get into that sort of aspect of this exhibition. And again, I'm gonna really turn it over to Gabby, who's gonna share with us the body of research, right? Which is where this whole thing started, was finding out that there were amazing stories of Staten Island women. And then moving from that into how do we tell this story? And we're gonna help Gabby when we get to that part. Each one of us is gonna take one of the kind of tactics around which we organize the show and share with you tidbits from that story. But we'll start with you, Gabby.
So I think that, as I said, the sort of first idea that I had that suffrage was going on Staten Island, that there was an active movement here, was in reading the Staten Island World, the local newspaper, the women's column, which is called Staten Island Women Folk. And actually, often women journalists were the ones covering these events, and they were writing under pen names. So there are some great pen names: Electra Sparks, Henrietta Hudson, Voteress covered the the local meetings of the Suffrage Association. And so I thought that, sort of like Debbie said, if this was going on, there had to be more. And I'm fortunate enough to work in an archive, which means we had to have some of that information available to us. And so one of the first places we looked was this collection from a museum founder, Arthur Hollick, and his wife, Adeline, who were involved in the founding of the museum. And he was a scientist by specialty, but he was very interested in history and collected newspaper clippings and things that I knew for posterity. And so he had a collection of women's magazines, and that's sort of just what we knew about them. So we went looking, and they turned out to be the Woman Voter, the Woman Citizen, and the Suffragist. And even in early iterations of looking through these magazines, I didn't really understand what they were. It took some research to really understand what they were. And they're the publications of the National American Women Suffrage Association, the New York State Women's Suffrage Association, and later on the National Women's Party, Alice Paul's organization. And so they're really examples of suffragists telling the story and making the argument for why they should have the right to vote in their own words, which I thought was incredibly powerful, because so often when you're reading history, you're reading it from a secondary source, and it's someone telling the story for the suffragists. But this was an example of the suffragists themselves in their own words explaining why it was important that they have the right to vote. So once we really understood what those were and how valuable they were, we decided to digitize them. We got a grant through Metro Library Council, and we digitized the two that were not already online, the Women Voter and the Suffragist. We made them available on Internet Archive, and we were also able to use them then for research for this incredible story. So the more we dug, the more we found. We found the borough chair people of Staten Island, Mary Otis Wilcox, Edith Whitmore, writing in to the woman voter explaining what suffrage activities were going on Staten Island. We found connections between the suffrage movement on Staten Island and leaders of the movement, like Carrie Chapman Catt came and spoke here, who was later a president. And so that opened up these other collections that then we could go and look for more information at Bryn Mawr or at the New York Public Library. And so the more we dug, the more we found. And one of the things we found was the organizational document from 1916 of the National American Women Suffrage Association, laying out their plan for the year, how they were going to go about activism in that year. And they said that they were going to pursue a campaign of organization, education, agitation, and publicity in order to secure an amendment for suffrage. And that's radical or that shows a shift in the movement for a lot of different reasons that we'll probably get to later. But I thought, if we're looking at this as a grassroots movement, if we're telling the local story, we're telling the bottom of the suffrage activism, how that went about, then to look at it through the lens of tactics would make a lot of sense. And so the anatomy of the women's suffrage movement, we said when we organized the exhibit, was through these four tactics: educate, organize, agitate, publicize, and of course then vote is the next thing that follows, right? And so we thought that we could tell the story then through the lens of these tactics and really look at the suffrage movement on Staten Island as the grassroots level of this national story.
Beautiful. And so let's get into that story. We've heard a little bit from Gabby about publicize, right? That's kind of where this vision started, in part thanks to Dr. Hollick and his collection of these suffrage periodicals that then you can read through and look for Staten Island women and their names. And so what did we learn? Well, let's together help tell that story. And again, we're gonna go through it somewhat chronologically as we're telling this, but these tactics keep coming round and round and round. So think of it that way as well. Susan, you want to get us started with educate?
I sure do. Education is one of my favorite topics. The education piece, really, one thing I'd like to say, what Gabby's talking about is an articulation in 1916 of something that had been going on really in one way or another since the 1840s. And maybe even earlier if we want to, depending on how we describe education. So most women who were very active in thinking about their increasing their rights understood that any woman who was educated would also be interested in expanding her rights. So education for us means reading and writing and being a college student and that kind of thing. But for women in the years before women got to go to college, education included listening to speeches and gathering perhaps, and this is something that has come up, will probably come up again, is the parlor. At first, women would gather in the parlors in their own homes, and they would have tea, and they would begin to talk about what rights they had, what rights they didn't have. So it was very private in many ways. Then as time went on, there was conventions were held, conferences were held, and those conventions and conferences would draw people from all over, women, men, black, white, from all over the state. And they would come in and they would listen to the speeches of women like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, Mary Walker, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these different people from around the state. And so that was another way of educating. The suffrage organizations, even early on, would publish that. So education is intertwined with publicity as well. All of these different agitation and organizations, they're all intertwined. But they would republish some of this and then distribute these pamphlets and broadsides. And some of those are on display in the exhibit. So you can see those things. But that's been going on right from the early years. It's harder to find the early stuff, but it's there. And so education continues in that way. As we move closer to the 19th, the turn of the 19th century, and into the 20th century, we begin to see correspondence courses. And so these clubs and organizations that would sprout up all over the state, and were hundreds of these clubs. Some of them lasted a long time, some of them only had a handful of members, but they would purchase the correspondence courses. And they were a series, I think there were 12 of them, so one for each month. And so they would focus on what the vote meant, how to get it, how to organize, how to agitate, how to educate others. And so education, it was always felt from the very beginning that once women knew what the laws said, what their own rights were, that then they would want to expand those rights. And so education was critical to that process.
And that's great. And you're already starting to get us in talking about these organizations and these clubs into this idea of organize, right? So you kind of get an awareness of, hey, what do I not have that I might have? And then you start talking to people. And once you get more people educated, then you get together and Debbie Ann, take it. What happens next? You're on mute.
I remember when we first sat down and first met each other, and we were sitting around that big, huge table, and we were trying to talk about the exhibit and the write-up and the language. And I kept hearing they were in the parlors and they moved from the parlors out into the public sphere. And I kept thinking, women of African descent have always been in the public sphere. They didn't have the luxury of these parlors, and that they, they organized as early as the Underground Railroad, right? So that they could find their own freedom. And so for me, organizing under those auspices, took on a different tenor. So as I looked at it, organizing was created a space where Black women had to form alliances and had to do coalition building outside of the historical or traditional movement, because as one person put it, the heroes of the movement kind of pushed back and reverted to what they called a classic liberal racism, where as they tried to find a space, as the 15th Amendment is coming around, and they're understanding that it is now going to give the Black man a vote, and they aren't going to be able to step into that vote at the same time, they then push out Black women. They're no longer allies in this abolition movement or this anti-slavery movement. They now turn their sights to something else. So Black women, women like Anna Julia Cooper says that she feels the need to say, when and where I enter, there the whole Negro race enters with me. That they have now taken on this responsibility of where they're being forced almost to choose between their Blackness or their womanhood. And they're saying, we're not doing that. So we're going to disengage, and we're going to put together where we're going to organize ourselves, because we all still want this suffrage. We still all want freedom. We're just going to go about getting it differently. So then you have organizations that are created like Delta Sigma Theta sorority. They're saying, you know, sororities are created, Alpha Kappa Alpha is there, and these 22 women are saying, we need to be more politically engaged. And yes, we're at Howard University. And so, yeah, this is where the education piece comes in, kind of folds into the Black experience. But they're saying, there's a march coming up. Alice Paul is saying that she doesn't want us to be a part of it. Alice Paul is saying things like, either there's going to be a white procession or a Negro procession or no procession at all. If they have to engage, then they'll engage in the back of this march. Ida B. Wells then says, okay, I want to be a part of the Illinois delegation, because we're all supposed to be women who are seeking suffrage. The Illinois delegation tells them, no, you can't be a part of this, you know, go march with Black women in the back. So again, it's this disparaging parsing out of when and where it's okay to either be of African descent or to embrace my womanhood. And so moving through that, they get through this march. Ida B. Wells decides, okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna sit and wait in the middle of this march, and I'm gonna wait till the Illinois delegation goes by, and then I'm just gonna run out there. Stop me. So she runs out, she stands in the front of it, she marches with them. But again, this shows that they're unwanted. Women of color are unwanted in this movement, because they're afraid that the organizers, or the white-centered organizers, are afraid that the white women in the South won't back them if Black women are a part of this movement. And so they create things like, and I'm just going to try to pull some stuff up. They create things like the trying to see the name of it, the different Black women's clubs, and there's whether you're an elk or, you know, whatever the group is that you create, you have these separate groups who are trying to now navigate and organize and create allies. And so finally they do some coalition building, and they create these federation of Black women's clubs, and where all of the clubs now are able to come together and organize and kind of create a national movement within this different level of women of African descent.
And I think one of the things that we're sort of we're going back and forth between the national story, right, and the Staten Island story. So I don't know, Gabby, do you want to fill in a couple of specifics of how some of these themes that that Debbie Ann has mentioned and that Susan mentioned were playing out specifically in the Staten Island stage?
Sure. Well, I think you know, Susan mentioned speakers in the second half, or the mid to late 1800s on Staten Island. That would have been the Curtis family. They were, George William Curtis was a famous orator, abolitionist, supporter of women's suffrage, and he spoke at the 1867 New York State Constitutional Convention advocating for women's suffrage way back in the middle of the 1800s. His daughter, then Elizabeth Burrell Curtis, took up the fight in the 1890s. She also addressed the New York State Constitutional Convention for women's suffrage, and she founded the Political Equality Club on Staten Island, which is what Susan was talking about, these local organizations evolving to push out this message. But as Debbie said, those organizations often didn't include women of African descent. And so what space did they find to organize and to act, to pursue their causes? Were the AME Zion Church on Staten Island was very active. So you had Rossville AME Zion Church, and then a little later Shiloh AME Zion Church on the North Shore. They both belong to the New Jersey Conference instead of the New York Conference, which is an interesting distinction here on Staten Island. And so the Rossville Church had the Buds of Promise, which was a women's organization that focused on social activism, suffrage was one of the things they pursued, and they belonged to the New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and the president, the pastor at Rossville, and the president of the New Jersey Federation was this woman, Florence Spearing Randolph, who is a reverend, who is a suffragist and very active in many different causes, temperance as well. So Susan and Debbie are talking about this national story, and it was really playing out here, as you said.
And I just think that it's, you know, to me, again, I like to think about this of where, kind of like what Debbie Ann said, where do I fit in, right? And one of my favorite little tidbits in this organized section of the exhibition talks about high school yearbooks, right? What a great source to find how, as young as high schoolers, they're getting involved in clubs with their teachers who are going to suffrage parades, right? Like we mentioned the National Parade in 1913, the one that Ida B. Wells decided to integrate in that way. And, you know, Linda French, a high school teacher, right, from Staten Island. Was it that parade, Gabby, or was it a later one?
She was in New York. She was in the New York parades.
Okay. Well, but that kind of gets into my section, right? I'm going to tell you a little bit about agitate, right? So one of the amazing things that happens at this time is there's all kinds of new technology and new sort of modes of communication. I mean, even in our little Staten Island Museum image you see right there, you can see how Margaret interpreted this in a way to have this flashy, bold font of "Women of the Nation Arise." And that comes from the history that these women were working to be splashy and be out there. And so they had these mass parades and demonstrations wearing all white, having huge oversized banners. And where Staten Island comes into this story, there's little ways and big ways. So just two examples that I love is one little way, which is part of the story is the campaign for suffrage, right? Do you try to get state by state by state, or do you go for a federal amendment, right? This is one of the big tactical questions in this movement. And so during the Empire State Campaign in 1915, the idea was that New York State would get a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. And there was a suffragist on Staten Island named Alberta Hill who told her fiance, "I can't marry you until after we get this passed," right? And so they set their wedding date for a few days later. Of course, the amendment does not pass, and it's this massively tragic defeat for folks who've been involved in this. Not only did New York State lose that year, but also amendments that tried in Connecticut and New Jersey and Massachusetts. So it was just the whole suffrage movement was at this crossroads. And here's Miss Alberta Hill having to, you know, well, I don't having to, but she gets to get married anyway a couple days later. But she kind of gets the final word in it. Sorry, I gotta get my notes for this one. But so she's getting married at Our Lady of Good Counsel Church on Staten Island. And when Father O'Donnell asks her, will she obey her husband? She dramatically bowed and said, no, right? So this is these small ways, right? And that a Staten Island woman was participating in this cause and not giving up the fight. But then there are big ways, right? And we mentioned new technology. And one of the kind of amazing pieces of new technology in this era, in the 19-teens, is planes, right? Airplanes. And so Staten Island women, I'm going to just read you this too to make sure I get it right, right? It's December 1916. And President Wilson is going to go out on a yacht to ceremonially light the Statue of Liberty. And a bunch of suffragists get together and decorate a plane that says women want liberty too, right? And this is an important thing. So the plan is to go, and they've got a female pilot who is one of the first graduates of the Wright Flying School. And she takes off from Staten Island with the publicity chair of the New York State Women's Suffrage Party. And they're about to go, and they're gonna leaflet bomb this yacht, right, with Votes for Women pamphlets. Unfortunately, technology doesn't always work. The plane crashes outside, you know, the marshy lands outside of Staten Island. Nobody is hurt, but publicity nonetheless, right? And this is one of the big pieces that just keeps coming up again and again, that Gabby mentioned, right? So by this point in the movement in the 19-teens, You can get articles in the newspaper again and again, and you can be publishing your own specific suffrage periodicals, such as the ones Gabby had mentioned. So we've done, Gabby, do you want to chime in?
I do. I just wanted to say that that was the flight you mentioned was the second flight for suffrage on Staten Island. The first being in 1913, suffragist Rosalie Jones, who's from Long Island originally, so not that far away, comes to Staten Island and gets in a plane with a pilot, a local pilot, Harry Bingham Brown, and she drops suffrage leaflets across part of Staten Island and lands at this carnival. It was an aeronautical carnival, and she gives this impassioned speech about how you might have thought suffrage went up in the air and you would never hear about it again, but you won't go anywhere this year without hearing from a suffragist. And that sort of was the inspiration for much of the exhibit design and also the biplane sculpture that is outside the museum.
Perfect. So we're moving along, and here we get to vote, right? So Cathy, what are some highlights from this exhibition, from the vote section for you? You're still on mute.
It starts off with a quote from the Staten Island Women's Civic and Political Union on the wall. It says, "Election day is your day to write clearly on the pages of history. This is the way I want my city, my state, and my country to run." And that is so true today. The vote section of the exhibit, for me, is really a call to action. The vote is a very powerful weapon in a citizen's arsenal. And if you don't think your vote is powerful, ask yourself why so many people are trying to take away your right to vote, or why they're trying to take it away from other groups of people. Ask them why so many people are willing to spend big money to buy your votes. The PACs, the campaigns, the absentee ballot operations, et cetera, et cetera. If it's not important, why would they be doing it? The vote is also, that section is also about the 19th Amendment, which is only one sentence long. It says, "The right of a citizen of the United States to vote shall not be deterred or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." One would have thought at that time all women could vote in 1920, but that was not the case. All Black women did not get the right to vote until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, 45 years later. The League as a whole didn't invite Black women to join, leaving the League not as strong as it could have been if it had embraced diversity, equality, and inclusion before 2000. You've talked about how the Black women in Staten Island created their own groups. The Women's Civic Political Union as one. They had the church groups, and other organizations took up the mission to educate fellow Black women how to vote, what the issues were, and encourage them to exercise their freedom. But the problems come because voting laws are local. Other states and communities, they started to chip away at part of the Voting Rights Act, and they tried to exclude certain parts of the population based on race, class, and ethnicity. The 1920 didn't include the Native American community until 1923 when the Native American Citizenship Act happened. It didn't include the Chinese, which needed the 1943 Act to become citizens. The Voting Rights Act is so important to us because it removed most of these barriers in voting and strengthened the right and guarantees under the 15th and 19th Amendment. New York City was under the Voting Rights Act because they had violated in 3 of the 5 boroughs. I'm not exactly sure what they did, but they fell under it, so that every time until 2013, everything that they did that changed any election law had to go in front of a US judge. So it wasn't just something that is a problem in one part of the country or not. New York City had it. And then sadly we took our eyes off the prize as a voting act, and not paying attention, the rights were whittled down. And 48 years after the Voting Rights Act, it was gutted by the Supreme Court decision of Selby versus Holder. And so that's why I call it a call to action, because our country, our cities, our communities in the United States need to have their voter rights restoration so that we can ensure safe, fair, free elections in the future.
And the organization that you've devoted over a decade of your life to grew out of the New York Suffrage Association, right? So in 1919, how did that shift happen? What did the organization take on once that occurred?
Well, June 2nd, 1919, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the notes go that we are changing our name from the National Association of Women to the League of Women Voters. I think we were one of the first leagues, because we are 3 years ahead of National. And what they did, they had set out their mission, their bylaws, and they were going to set up schools to educate women. They were going to concentrate on issues, and they were going to concentrate on studying of the issues so that they could advocate for them. And the big one that they came up with in 1922-23 was the Sullivan Act against child labor. And one of the first, I love this, one of their first actions was to study the public park hygiene. Hygiene is the word they used, so that children could have a safe place to play.
How very fitting for these days when everyone's studying public park hygiene, right, in light of the coronavirus. And I just wanted to continue in thinking about this, about how things changed or didn't. I don't know if you, Gabby, or you, Debbie, want to tell some of the story about the African-American women on Staten Island and how their political organizing shifted after the attainment of the vote. Does one of you want to tell part of that story?
I'll go first, Gabby, and then you can go after me. Okay, so as we were doing a lot of the research for it, we discovered a woman by the name of Drusilla Poole. And as we looked at Drusilla Poole, she was just this incredible powerhouse. She, immediately after the amendment passed, they create a voting an organization that will specifically teach African-American women about the vote, how to do it, what to do, what the issues were, how to organize around it. I mean, she really organized them, and from 1919 all the way up until her death, that's what she did. She made sure that women, she used the Shiloh Amy Zion Church was the church where she worshiped, and she used the church as a meeting place to educate African-American women about the vote and how to go about that. There was another woman that I just discovered recently that we weren't able to put in the exhibit because she's so much later as well. But her name is Nettie Carter Jackson, and she, in 1959, saved Martin Luther King's life. She was born in Stapleton, but she was, with that first assassination attempt, she was a part of every single club that there was on Staten Island, across New York, where her thing was about the vote. And she actually was one of those women who were able to move from the fully African-American space and integrate a lot of the other spaces. I believe, Cathy, that she was a part of the League of Women Voters as well. was like, what? I didn't know that. That's interesting. So,
Yeah, there are many Black members now, thank goodness.
right, and she was early on. She was like in the 30s and the 40s where she was doing this kind of work. And so African American women on Staten Island were very political. They organized just like everyone else in terms of organizing the vote and what that meant to them. Unfortunately, the stories are hard to find because of how the stories were being told. And so sometimes you can look at stories and find out things that are not there, to find out, to be able to reimpose things that should be there.
Can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean?
Well, so as you look at the absence of things, sometimes you can say, well, if they're absent from here, then they've got to exist somewhere else, because we know that they exist. And so it allows you to say, well, if this is going on, if this, then that sometimes. But again, the NAACP was formed on Staten Island in 1925, and Drusilla Poole was the first secretary. So while they're fighting for housing rights, while they're because the NAACP starts around housing rights on Staten Island, but because Drusilla Poole is the secretary, she helps to shift and build out the voting piece of that as well. So there's a lot of spaces that Drusilla kind of touches her hand on across Staten Island in the Black community that allows the vote to really take hold, or the urgency of the vote to take hold.
Wonderful. I think hopefully we've given you sort of a broad sweep of this movement, both sort of the Staten Island stories and some individuals, and the bigger picture. I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to add anything, any plugs for the exhibition, particular pieces that folks can see. And I should mention, there are ways of seeing it, even though the museum is temporarily closed, right? There is the online exhibition, which is wonderful, on the new website that Janice had mentioned. And there's also in the outside, in Snug Harbor, these wonderful interpretive panels that offer pieces of this story as well.
So I just thought, Sarah, that I was gonna put up, I have on the website in the vote section an example of one of the study classes that the Women's Civic and Political Union offered.
That's
Drusilla Poole's organization. So if you can see it, it's difficult to see here, but I'll zoom in. It you can read, how old must a representative be? Not less than 25 years. What other state has the same registration requirements as New York? None. How may the privilege of the franchise of the vote be lost by the conviction of a felony, and so on and so forth. And so you can read that in the vote section under Drusilla Poole's section on the website. I'll actually even show you what it looks like. There's Drusilla. And this is how you navigate on the website to all the different sections of the exhibit. So if we've mentioned something here today that you want to know more about, you can consult the website online. So that's my plug, Sarah.
It's an excellent plug. And before we kind of shift gears and get Margaret involved in this conversation about, you know, how visually we told this and wanted folks to interact, we're going to do a version of it with you here, which is we're going to take a poll. Riley, I think you're back there somewhere at the controls. Aha! So which tactic would you take to affect change in a social movement? So if you, kind audience members, wish to share your particular contribution as you see how it would be, we'll take a look at that. I see there are 18 seconds left, so vote quick. Oh no, it's counting up, never mind.
That's awesome.
It really is. And I think that, you know, one of the things that from education and also from studying disabilities, which again, this is another anniversary of the ADA going on right now, is this idea of universal design, right? There's not just one way to be a suffragist, and we need each of you with each of these different types of personalities and expertise and comfort levels. And that's one of the things that to me as well is so powerful about the organization of this exhibition and how we understand what we can learn from suffrage, because just you here, those of us in this room reflect that diversity, and we need to all be a part of this and bring what we can. So with that, Margaret, I wanted to turn to you and say, okay, here are all of these people with these big ideas and stories and individuals and interesting objects and artifacts like the one that Gabby just shared with us. How did you approach this, and how did you go about thinking about how to bring this to the public?
Well, it was very clear that the team at the Staten Island Museum was very interested in making sure that this felt relevant to contemporary audiences, and that I think the thing that I took the most inspiration from were those tactics, which are all verbs, very active, and this whole sense that this is something that didn't just passively happen. This was an active struggle, and it continues to be an active struggle. In order to reflect that, I've got a couple of images that I'm going to share with you. And these are, I'm going to start with an image from the exhibition. And let's see, how about, we'll just start here just to show, this sort of gives you a sense of what the overall look and feel of the exhibition is. And I'm just going to try to, it seems like I no longer have the option to show you. Nope, there it is, full screen. All right, this is the first panel, the first thing that you see in the exhibition, and we're seeing one of the two prominent colors, the purple and gold, which are the colors of the suffrage movement in the United States. And they're versions of those colors that are kind of pumped up and oversaturated to reflect that contemporary connection. And as Sarah spoke about earlier, the choice of the font, everything is bold and italicized for that action feel. So that's meant to look exciting and bold and radical. These are the adjectives that the education team was using to describe this story. So that's where that comes from. And no, it looks like it's just taking my computer just like a little bit longer today to get through this. But this here is this is one of these, this is the graphic standards for the exhibition. So these are some inspiration imagery and some sample ideas for how we were going to then put together the graphic panels for the exhibition. So we've got our colors off to the left. The inspiration imagery is from zines, and there's a feminist tradition of creating zines and DIY publications, which is it's a continuation of a long tradition that Gabby was talking about, women starting their own publications and newspapers and things like that. So this is the contemporary version of that. And so that's reflected in this sort of like this collage look that we've got going, with multiple images that are layered on top of one another, cut with jagged edges, and then torn in some places. And the overall effect is reminiscent of those zines. It's not a direct lift from that, but it's meant to have that same kind of energy and that sense of action and activism. So these next couple of slides that I have for you are process images of how we did one of these activities that are in the exhibit. This is something that the panelists will find familiar looking. This is an example of, this is an early example of one of the activities, which is a dichotomous key. And you've maybe used a dichotomous key if you've ever identified an animal in a biology class. This is or a plant. This is one of the, this is a scientific tool, but it's also used for personality quizzes that you might find in a magazine like Cosmo. And so this one here has a series of questions that begin from the left, and they will result in one of the activists who is highlighted in the exhibition. And this is another example of one that the results that you're getting in pink are the names of different kinds of activists. So instead of individuals, these are names for what that role might be. What we ended up with in the exhibition is this one here. And instead of going from left to right, we're going from top to bottom now, but we've got it's the second one that kind of made the cut, and visitors can begin at the start here button, and they can follow through with their finger to answer the questions and decide whether they think that they would be an agitator, a candidate, an organizer, an educator, or a publicizer. And really the goal here is about relevance, and it's also about finding those personal connections in the exhibition. These are all actions and roles that people play in any struggle. Like these are all these are relevant to any social justice movement that anyone is participating in today. And I really liked the idea of giving people an access point for thinking through how they might continue that struggle, because it does continue, as Cathy was explaining. Like this wasn't just a singular moment. This is one chunk of time that we're looking at, and that people are still facing disenfranchisement when it comes to voting today. So this is a very still very much a relevant fight.
Margaret, were there any, I mean, part of what was so exciting and fun for us, I mean, Margaret would come to our meetings with games for us to play, right? Like this is really kind of cool to get up and practice that and learn about each other, and imagine visitors doing that at the show. So were there any of them or ideas that you had for interactives like this that didn't make it in, or maybe never even made it to our table as a group, that you would want to share with us?
Well, I think that I guess technically the timeline is at the museum, but it didn't make it into the exhibition. And I was sad about that because I think that it really illustrates the concept behind the timeline is that it's a series of moments in time that are before and after this movement that we're looking at specifically in the exhibition. And visitors are then asked to use cards to that are we've got like a personality card, and visitors are asked to see where on the timeline that person on the card would have gotten the right to vote. And there some of them don't necessarily ever get that right, and I think that there was something really exciting about showing all of the nuances for this for this topic specifically, that like not all women got the right to vote at the when the 19th Amendment passed, and that there are still people today who don't have that right, and then there are some people who gained and then lost that right. So like that's an interesting thing to see there. And those are all things that I think are very challenging to demonstrate through text. Like I think that's one of the great things about using activities and exhibitions. My background is in children's museums, and the learning that we do in children's museums is almost entirely experiential. There's very, very little text, and it's always a fun challenge to think of ways to create experiences for visitors that will get across concepts that are sometimes very, very complicated, like this one.
We benefited so much from that way of thinking and that way of learning. I mean, one of the things I remember from one of the meetings was realizing that, yeah, on the one hand, we're asking, okay, what am I most comfortable with? Public speaking, writing, right? But there are all these other factors that factor into it. If I'm a Black woman, but I'm most comfortable standing out on the street corner speaking, that I may not have access to that way of doing it, or I may not have access to, you know, some other way of doing things. And I think that's one of the interesting things I've been thinking about as we start shifting into the new, into the second part of our talk today, which is about the contemporary movements, that what we can learn from these experiences of the past to bring toward our interpretation of them today. And one of them I've been thinking a lot about, and so much that's been coming out in the last several months, is about this idea of positionality, right? Who are you, and what can you do, and what ought you do as a part of the movements that we see today? And so, you know, again, just to kind of set the stage for this, we planned this exhibit and opened it in the pre-COVID world, right? Before George Floyd's murder and the renewed momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement. So these contemporary, very real, very emotional and pressing issues in our lives are making us all reflect on our own role in society and on our own role in changing it, what we have access to, what we don't, what we feel comfortable doing, what we don't. And so in this second half, I wanted to hear from the scholars about what we learn and how, you know, this past shapes what will go on in the present and in the future. So before we get into that, I just wanted to pause and see if there were any other thoughts. It's so hard because we can't read body language in this format. Do any of the panelists want to add anything more before we move into this next section? Or are there questions from the folks in the attendees that you want to put into our Q&A?
I really liked what Margaret said about the timeline, because I was sad, also very sad, because the time is so long and we still are fighting it. I mean, it started with the Declaration of Independence and Abigail Adams, and then along the way, in 1807, New Jersey women lost the right to vote. New York women had it for a while, then they lost it before 1807. The Jim Crow laws that affected voting, voter suppression today with purges, etc., ID laws. And so it's 254 years since the Declaration of Independence, and the suffrage hit in 144, I think. Yeah. That 144 years before they could write those two amendments. But still, the last 100 years, we're still trying to fight to get those rights back. All the rights that are in the amendments, that we should be able to vote without problems. It should be safe, and it should be fair. And I think today what's really kind of interesting is people are speaking out from every walk of life. It's just not the League of Women Voters anymore. There's the athletes speaking about it. The theater people are speaking about it. The arts people are speaking about it. Various groups are speaking about it. You can't turn on your television set if they're talking about a problem that somebody doesn't say, don't forget to vote, because if you want this issue solved, you have to vote. And I have never in my life heard about voting since March to now as many times. And it's like it's becoming this big community that say you have to vote if you want to change your world. And it's so important.
It's such a perfect transition, because I wanted to start with you, Cathy, and ask you to speak about, yes, it's amazing to hear you have to vote if you want to change the world, but we're living in a pandemic when people aren't feeling comfortable going outside in certain cases. And so what advice do you have? How has the League of Women Voters changed its messaging, or what is it telling folks to do in this moment about how to get access and keep access to the vote?
Oh, it is very tough. Because we are basically virtual. Our office was closed, leaving staff members and working from home. All our meetings went virtual. New voter registration training went virtual. But we still answer our phones, so that's good. We found out from the community board, the finance campaign board, that this year, before June 1st, only 80,000 new voter registrations happened. Well, in 2016, new voter registration was at 155,000. So we have lost 75,000 potential voters. Right now, we are not doing voter registration drives. We're not going into schools. We're not going into clubs. We're not going into churches. And that's very sad. We hope to go in before September 22nd, which is National Voter Registration Drive. So the way the League has adapted is we have tried to turn what we have, and our website has always been mobile friendly. But because of the marchers started asking for things like, how do I find my voter registration form? How do I find the application for an absentee ballot? Am I a registered voter? We created a bunch of QR codes that would work on a phone so that a person marching would be able to share the information if somebody was there, because we were not there. Yeah. The voting system as a whole has been impacted. We had a whole lot of problems with the absentee ballot. And the way we are fighting right now is with coalitions to change the process of voting by changing the laws. So last year, 2019, was a hallmark for voter reforms, and these are things that the League fought for. 38 new laws were signed affecting voting and the system, and some of them are pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, assuming that if people start young voting, that they will continue voting. We got the right to early voting. There are uniform polling hours across the state. February 14th is the last day to change your party enrollment for that year's election. We got electronic poll books. We got the consolidated primaries, putting the federal and state primaries into one in June. Every New York State voter registration is portable from one part of the country, from Buffalo to Brooklyn. We made sure that special ballots were being sent to victims of domestic violence. They also made childcare for candidates available, and they could use campaign funds. This year, we're still working. Hopefully the legislature will come back. But we've got no excuse absentee voting for the primary and general election. That means you just check the box 2 saying temporary illness. The deadline to register to vote has been reduced from 25 to 10 days. They passed a 2-hour mandatory pay for all workers to go out and vote. And they also passed voter registration for automatic voter registration for 2023. It passed this year's, but it has to pass next year's legislative session and then pass a ballot referendum. We had hoped that they would be working on New York City online voter registration portal at the Campaign Finance Board, but that didn't get past the Assembly. Mandate that absentee ballots have a tracking system. New York City Council voted in 2016, but the New York City Board never implemented. That would have stopped a lot of the problems of absentee ballots not being accepted because they didn't have a postmark. And
there's a question here, and I don't know if you know the answer, if anyone on the panel does it. Eric was wondering if there are other countries that are dealing with the same suffrage problems that we are. And if so, are there solutions that have helped them to deal with those problems? I'm not sure if this question is specific to the pandemic or more in general about a lack of access to voting for all.
Well, I can tell you that Switzerland didn't get suffrage for women until 1974. I know there's a lot of, Saudi Arabia just got the right to vote. The women got the right to vote, or they're fighting for it today. So it is definitely not a problem that has gone away for women to have a voice in the government that controls everything they do. It's a good question.
It is.
And I must admit I have only peripheral knowledge. I know that some of the countries have, the National League has gone out to talk to them. But it seems so strange to say in 2020 that women, black men, Native Americans are being disenfranchised because they don't have a street address. There are so many people that are being unenfranchised. The voter rolls are being purged. Voter education is not up there. Poll workers are not being trained. This last one was a disaster in the city because they didn't have poll worker training at all. And some polling sites and did not give out the second ballot. So people that went only voted for president. They didn't vote for their local, yeah. So I'm a poll worker also. I coordinate a poll site. My problem was electricity and the Wi-Fi.
One of my greatest issues is the great irony that homeless veterans can't vote because they don't have an address. Like I don't even understand how that is even possible, that I have put my life on the line to ensure that you can vote. And when I come back, because of whatever the circumstances are, that I no longer have the ability to exercise that right that I've just fought and more than likely given a part of my life that I can't get back, in terms, because it's usually some kind of TBI or some kind of post-traumatic stress that has even landed me in the position why I'm homeless. And so it's these things that are compounded on top of it that is just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, homeless theoretically can register to vote. They can say, I'm on the park bench at Prospect Park and President Street, but they have to have a place like down the street from us in Brooklyn is a society called CHIPS that provides food and services recommendations, and they take in mail. So like if the church takes in the mail, the Salvation Army, if they have, or their sister, brother, parents, they can use that address. They can register to vote, and they can say they sleep on park bench in Central Park, but that address, the second address, is hard for a lot of them because they don't have it.
Right.
And yeah, everybody should have the voice. We need all the voices in this country to come together, because as collectively we are stronger than we are separately.
And one of the really powerful things in that document that Gabby shared with us, that was made by the Women's Civic and Political Union, was about felons, right? When gets disenfranchised as felons. So I want to sort of shift our conversation, right, into another massive movement that's happening right now that has to do with the relationship between people of color in this country and the criminal justice system, right? The police and the criminal justice system. And so these pieces are connected in a couple of different ways, one in terms of enfranchisement or disenfranchisement, and another in terms of strategies and tactics for movement building, right? As we're seeing this sort of groundswell of activism. So in the sort of pre-conversation leading up today, I had asked if Debbie Ann would share some of the experience she's had working with folks who are organizing on Staten Island right now as a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, to just sort of talk about what role history, the suffrage movement's history, or any history of organizing is playing within the movement that's coming out today.
There's one movement by the young leaders of Staten Island. They have been, I think, the most active and most successful in the organizing of these social justice protests. And so they had decided that they would create a march that would honor the ancestors through the Underground Railroad and go out to the Sandy Ground, because you know, historically and traditionally, the history of Staten Island will shift you and land you at the Sandy Ground almost always. And so someone asked me to just speak to them, just to give them a little bit of the history. And so I did a presentation for these young, marvelous, fantastic young people that outlined the history of African Americans here on Staten Island, beginning in the 1630s, 1660s, all the way up until now. And I explained to them this notion of organizing called the 1st of August celebrations, where abolitionists or anti-slavery proponents would gather in these large gatherings to celebrate the emancipation of the enslaved peoples of the Caribbean, or from the British quote-unquote empire. And so on Staten Island in 1855, they had one of the largest celebrations. It took place in Clifton on the North Shore, which is different than the Sandy Ground being on the South Shore. And I shared with them an 1831 article from the Liberator newspaper that talked about freedom seekers from the Chesapeake area landing on the South Shore and making their way towards the North Shore. And so they were excited, because here is a way that they were like, 5,000 people from across the tri-state area came to Staten Island and celebrated they were outdone, and they were like, we're gonna do that. And so now they've created this fantastic 1st of August celebration called the Path to Liberation. And so it's going to infuse the freedom struggle and the different sites that are associated with the freedom struggle on Staten Island, like Park Church, where Wendell Phillips spoke, and West Brighton, where the abolitionists lived, and the quarantine station, or the former quarantine station down by the ferry, where there are slave narratives that talk about the Underground Railroad and coming through there. And they're gonna do this 5-hour march from the Sandy Ground and make their way to the North Shore to celebrate and infuse this history in their protest movements, to demand liberation in this social justice movement. And it was just, I felt humbled to be a small, tiny part of it, because when they heard the information, they took off running, and they have done a fantastic job.
Is there a way we could find out more details about that 1st of August?
They have a Facebook page called the Young Leaders of Staten Island, and they're in the process now of doing a press release to give more information about it. And so I will be posting it on my personal page, my Page One Assist page, my Staten Island OGS page, and any other page that anyone else would like some information. So it'll be all over Facebook. If anyone follows me, they'll be able to find the information.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I think one thing I just want to say too is that this connection to the abolition movement, right? That so many movements in American history have drawn from, the tactics from, and Susan mentioned that a little bit, even at the very beginning when we were talking about educate and these abolitionist speakers who were helping sort of train some of the first suffragists, and were also suffragists, but the two were combined in these efforts in figuring out how to change this place that we live in and expand access to rights and to freedom. And so I wanted to turn it to Susan, who really stands, as our, the sort of the scholar who's devoted her career to studying this past, to asking about the lessons learned and the parallels and especially around coalition building, which I think has been so powerfully a part of this recent movement in the Black Lives Matter struggle, and what lessons that the suffragists experienced or learned about coalition building that might be of interest or of use in our understanding what's going on today and charting for a future. Easy one.
Easy and complicated. When my co-author Karen and I began designing, figuring out, trying to plan the book that came out in 2017 on the suffrage movement in New York State, we decided that what we would do, which no one had done before, so I will kind of pat us on the back and say, I think we hit on something pretty brilliant, if you don't mind my sounding so arrogant. But the idea was that we would look at the separate groups that had agitated for the right to vote. And that was, we looked at rural women, we looked at immigrant women, we looked at African-American women, we looked at the men who supported the movement, we looked at actually World War I and how that was influential on the movement. And we tried to stay with a kind of timeline. So we looked from when the movement began in the 1840s in New York, and our focus was really on New York. And then to its culmination in the 1920s. And we talked a little bit about what happened afterward, but our book focused on these various groups. And I think that's the biggest, most powerful message that I would share. And you hear it in what Cathy is saying, you hear it in what Debbie Ann is saying, you hear it in what Gabby's saying. Sarah's mentioned it as well. And Margaret has made the point about how to talk about this. The key idea is coalition. The key idea is working across barriers, whether they're class, race, gender, whatever those are. The only way we accomplish anything in this world, the only way we reach any semblance of social justice is by cross-cultural, cross-race, cross-gender, crossing those lines. And we can make a lot of mistakes, and we can mess up, and and sometimes go in the wrong direction for a while, but it's only by this coalition building that we ever accomplished anything. When you think about the suffrage movement and you think about 3 generations of women and some men before it actually happened for any groups. And as we can say, they're women of color, Jim Crow laws, those kinds of things would prevent people from voting. But this constant agitation that crosses those lines. This is what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter. It's crossing those lines. That's what's critically important. And to me, that's what's most important to tease out of the record by looking at these diverse groups. Maybe not always the leadership, but teasing out those stories, as difficult and as challenging as teasing out those stories can be. And if there's time, I can talk about some of the reasons why I think that it's been challenging to tease out those stories. But that's, to me, the most important message, and that works for us today, that's critical for us to understand today.
I'd love to hear you talk about some of why it's challenging to tease out those stories, but also what are some of the challenges of coalition building? What are some kind of moments within the suffrage struggle that there was a choice that was made, and how did that affect what happened?
Well, I'll take a real easy example. Let's talk about race, and Debbie mentioned about the 15th Amendment. So that the 15th Amendment actually passed in Congress in 1869 and was ratified by the states in 1870. So this is just a few years, 4 or 5 years after the Civil War ended. The Civil War, one of the reasons it was fought was to end slavery. And then there's these Reconstruction amendments trying to put the country back together again. And so at that point, the United States, members of the United States government had decided there's a couple of things that are happening. One is that they're trying to figure out if if former enslaved people can vote. And so the first thing they've got to do is they've got to end slavery, which they do with the 13th Amendment. The next thing they need to do is they need to make those people citizens, and the 14th Amendment makes them citizens. But what the 14th Amendment also does is it suddenly says a citizen is male. That had never happened. In fact, if you look at the Constitution, the word male did not appear until the 14th Amendment. And then when the 15th Amendment comes along, it says those citizens, now male, of African-American citizens can vote, but they're all male now. Sojourner Truth said, she complained at one of the suffrage meetings that she attended. She said, why is it that all of the women are white and all of the blacks are men? What about black women? And so these kinds of things are barriers. But one of the points I want to make is that as these amendments are being discussed, which happens for a year or two before they're actually passed, Elizabeth Cady Stanton very notoriously began using very racist language and arguing that white women should get the right to vote first. And Frederick Douglass and other leaders said, no, men need to get the right to vote before women. And so, and some of the equal rights organizations that had been founded during the Civil War that were for black men didn't want black women in their organizations because of the distraction women would be. One side point I'd like to make is that and I've looked at this and wondered about this quite a bit. One of the answers to the question is that citizenship became very closely tied to soldiering. And Black soldiers did serve during the Civil War. There were the colored troops, and so there were hundreds, thousands of men that served. You can see a monument not too far away from Howard University when we think about some of the, you were talking about the organizations that were connected to Howard University, at historically Black college. You can see the names of all of the men who had served in the colored troops. But that citizen soldier connection, that left women out. There's also something I read relatively recently, like in the last couple of weeks, that said some of the women who were helping during the Civil War, either as nurses, some staffing, some who disguised themselves as men and fought. A lot of those women were thought to be promiscuous. And that was another reason for not wanting women to be included in this whole thing. But anyway, the point I wanted to make was that Elizabeth Cady Stanton began using very racist language. So too did Susan B. Anthony, and she said, for example, to Frederick Douglass, I don't want you to come and speak at our suffrage meeting in the South because the Southern women won't like that. And yet, Frederick Douglass remained friendly with Stanton, stayed in her home, and there's maybe a multitude of reasons for that. He and Susan B. Anthony stayed friendly. With Susan B. Anthony, for example, one of the women, and she's not from Staten Island, I'm sorry, but Hester Jeffrey, who was in Rochester, who knew and raised money for the Frederick Douglass Memorial that's in Rochester, she eulogized. She was a Black woman. She was actually African. She also had Native blood. She eulogized Susan B. Anthony, and Susan B. Anthony had asked her to speak over her remains. So we get a story that appalls us, and then when we begin to know a little bit more about the story, it's more complicated than that. And that's the thing I would warn people about. Yeah, you can make a cut and dry answer or statement. The movement was racist, and it was, but it's complicated. And so we see these other nuances here, and that's part of what we have to make our peace with about the movement. And we see it today with the Black Lives Matter movements, with the tearing down of statues. I mean, I was talking about a statue with Frederick Douglass. That's the original statue, but a couple of years ago, a woman used Frederick Douglass's grandson, great-grandson, I think, as a model, and she put a number of statues. One of those statues was torn down as part of this monument tearing down process. How do we address that? But anyway, but those are the kinds of things I would really say we really need to understand more of the nuances and those complications to understand the suffrage story and the story today. It remains very complicated.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Cathy wants to say something, and I also want to just open it up to some questions, and maybe I'll just read one of them before I turn it to you, Cathy. Hugo says, I no longer want to be registered as a Democrat. What party do women in this panel feel really represent women, minorities, and or people of color? Independent, Democratic, Socialist, other? Thank you all for your work. So a big question, but it kind of gets us toward the last thing that I wanted for us to talk about anyhow, which is, you know, what do we do? What do we do to try to continue this work, to reach that so what? What is your call to action? And with in mind the complications that Susan mentioned, and also the fact that these were people, all of the people who we mentioned, whether it was Linda French, the high school teacher, or Drusilla Poole, or Susan B. Anthony, right? All of these people were just regular people who decided this issue was important enough to spend their time figuring out the complications in order to find their way into change making in whatever way they felt was best suited to them and that they had access to. So with that thought in mind, Cathy, I don't know if you want to answer Hugo's question or if anyone else wants to take it. And please, folks in the audience, keep asking questions. Go ahead, Cathy.
I wanted to talk about Susan's nuances about the movement, and we can talk about the ratification as one of them. And there were many steps before that. We're down to Tennessee, the last state that was going to vote, and they thought possibly would vote for this suffrage movement. And they said, if this doesn't work, we're going to have to turn to the South. We have to go to a southern state. And how do we go to a southern state with having the fear of voters, white males, not wanting the Black population to outnumber them? And so the fright of white males in the South has created the Electoral College, caused some people who were abolitionists to become racist, using words that we would not like to hear. But the fear of the white population in the South being overrun by the voters, if both Black women and Black men could vote. That was back in 1920. So what do we, oh, the lady that doesn't want to register as a Democrat. I
think it was a gentleman, actually.
Oh, gentlemen. I understand that, but New York State is a closed primary state. And if you want the power of the primary, because that's where the power of the election, you have to be in one of the parties that holds a primary. And traditionally, it's only the Republicans and the Democrats that hold it. Every once in a while, Working Families puts up a primary. But the primary is the place where you get 6 or 8 choices of a candidate that is running. In the general election, you get everybody else's choice. If you don't vote in the primaries, which means you have to be part of one of the 2 major parties in New York State because of the closed primary system, you only get to get choices from others. And we have fusion voting. We have 8 known political parties, recognized political parties, and whoever ran on the Republican primary ticket or the Democratic primary ticket could show up on one of those lines. So if it was a Republican, it would be a conservative. It could have been, I forgot, or a Democrat would be Working Families, the Green Party, the Greenpeace. So you could vote for the candidate and you could also vote for the party you liked, but you still need to vote in the primary to get the choices. So I don't know if I'd give up your membership in a party yet.
Debbie Ann, were you going to say something a couple minutes ago? I think you came off mute. I don't know.
Just to speak to Susan's nuances when she talked about the coalition building, I think that for me, you know, as I look through the records and see what was happening, because I read David Blight's new book. Well, I listened to the 36 hours of it. Right. Which really lays out the complications of Frederick Douglass the man. And I think that part is where, it becomes really difficult to understand it. One part that's troubling for me is the ability for some to be able to slip in and slip out of this anti-Black racism, right? So if I'm a person who, identifies as white, if I'm in a particular group and someone's saying something in terms of, Black people shouldn't have the vote, they can't vote, it's incumbent on me not to slip in that anti-Black racism mode by saying nothing or allowing the language to go on around me and just saying, well, I'm not saying it, so therefore, that's not me. There's an active role that we all need to play in order to do that. So if African Americans or Black and brown people are being disenfranchised, it's incumbent on me to say that if they aren't free, I'm not free. And so I have to do something different. So again, we have family members where it becomes uncomfortable when our family members may say things, but it's still Uncle Bob, and I still love Uncle Bob, but can I love Uncle Bob and allow him to say those things and carry that on to other people? It is difficult, and I'm not saying that it's not harsh. I've had family members say things that was like, no, you can't say that, in terms of why people may or may not vote, or what the issues are, Black Lives Matter, whatever those issues are. It's incumbent on us, I think, in the complications of the nuances, to be able to say, this is something, this is how I feel, I'm not appreciative of, and maybe there start the dialogue so that you can kind of unpack and come to some kind of consensus as to why you feel this way, why this is going on, and now is a new time to kind of shift how we see things, how we do things, especially in terms of voting. We have all of these stereotypes that say, oh, they don't do that, or they don't do that, whichever the they is. And we have to try to stay away from that kind of language and bring it around where we actually can talk to one another.
And that is just, I think, such a important point to close us with, is that, not only were these individual people, real people who made choices in their lives, but they also had conversations, right? Going back to educate and going back to the beginning. How is it that movements start moving, right? It's by people talking to each other and saying things maybe the other people don't want to hear, right? Hey, husband, I want to vote, I mean, I think that is such an important place to bring this conversation full circle, and to think about what we can do, even if we don't, right, go run for office. Certainly we want to all vote, but we need to be also having those conversations, and pushing things forward. And maybe also the idea that those conversations bit by bit, and I mean, the history of the women's suffrage movement shows how a group of people who didn't have power were given, not entirely, not fully, not everyone, not all at once, but there was progress that was made, right? And I think that that's something that we need in this moment, especially, to hold on to see that it is possible to make steps forward, and to increase access to power. So I want to thank so much everybody for this conversation and the many conversations that we've been able to have. I have learned so much from all of you, and I hope that we'll get to continue. I know that Janice wanted to come back on to just say one last thank you to everybody and give some more information. And there's one last poll as well. So maybe you could put the poll up, Riley, as Janice is gonna come back and join us. So how will you take action in your own community? Terrific. We've got people doing just about everything but serving as a poll watcher, so maybe I'll take that one on.
Love that there was 100% voting. Excellent.
They should become poll workers. We
Yeah.
need poll workers desperately.
Well, thank you all for participating today. There were many of you on the webinar, so thank you all for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. And again, I want to thank Sarah Litvin for moderating today and all of her work as a scholar on this, as well as Debbie Ann Paige, Dr. Susan Goodier, Catherine Gray, Margaret Middleton, and the museum's archivist, Gabriella Leone. So I really appreciate all that you've contributed today and leading up to today. And I think you've given us so much to think about. Obviously, I was involved with this whole effort, but again, I learned today and we keep learning, and we will take action. And here from the League of Women Voters is a slide where you can see some of the actions that you can take. So you can see the list there in terms of making sure about your voter registration status and where your polling site is, who represents you. And you know, another thing that I really want to emphasize today is a major effort happening amidst the difficult circumstances of coronavirus is the census this year. And so cultural organizations have been trying to do our part to make sure that people are also responding to the census. So you can see that link on the screen right now as well, my2020census.gov. And it only takes a few minutes to fill out, and that really does directly affect you know, federal funds that come to New York City and you know, thereby the museum as well. So, you know, it really, everybody needs to be counted. There's a history of undercounting, and this is a really important effort this year, and obviously it's made a little more difficult. So, you know, take the few minutes to make sure that you're counted in the census too. And there's our website, lastly, thank you, statenislandmuseum.org. So if you did enjoy today's program, please consider a small donation to the Staten Island Museum. Your $10 or $20 or more add up. And these are obviously really trying times for cultural organizations amongst so many in this COVID-19 situation we have. So we do appreciate you financially supporting the museum if you're able to do so. So there's a donate button right on the homepage on statenislandmuseum.org. I'd also like to mention before we close that the Staten Island Museum is an organizer of the Women's Suffrage NYC Centennial Consortium. It's a collaboration of cultural organizations citywide that foregrounds exhibitions and programs about women's suffrage this year. So you can find more online about that at womenssuffragenyc.org. There will be lots of events in August because it's the anniversary of the suffrage movement. So on August 26th, additionally, buildings all around New York City, including the Staten Island Museum, will be lit up in suffrage purple to mark Women's Equality Day. So you can look forward to that. And the museum will also have additional suffrage-themed programs this fall. So please do stay tuned for our virtual programs. Enjoy perusing the Women of the Nation Arise exhibition on the museum's website and outdoors at Snug Harbor this summer. We will hope to reopen the museum's doors with social distancing and safety measures in place as soon as we are able. Thank you so much for being part of this program today, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.